Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Dr. Aaron Sheley. I got my PhD in writing at the California Institute of the Arts. And I'll be teaching the last 4 classes, and I taught the first 12, of this D.W.Griffith Auteur study. It's a film class, Film Studies 375, can be transferred to either a top undergraduate or graduate class if there's written permission with the specific final that would go with the master's class of this same class. And since this is a YouTube masterclass, Coursera, we want all the opportunities you have to get the credits for this class, that you didn't just sit through this in vain, and you have learned some of history of style of film or some of history of film that you may not have known before, that was very vague to you before and now is clearer. And this all comes from the historiosity of the man himself, D.W.Griffith, and he's this eccentric filmmaker, is how you would describe him, that makes controversial type films. The one that we keep coming back to and keep coming back to is my first personal favorite, The Birth of a Nation. I mean, we've thrown every race card at it. We've looked at it from every shot, like with the book, the shot-by-shot analysis of Birth of a Nation, and then we saw DJ Spooky come in with his hierarchy machine and show how hierarchies are established just through the imaging of this movie. We've also found kind of a benign quality to it that is kind of outdated, that it kind of just doesn't fit today's scheme of the way we feel about things. But I have a feeling there are a few, if not quite a few, that are wondered and more interested in if whether there was an ideological proof or that something that was trying to be maintained or established by Birth of a Nation. I know that it was based on the short story The Klansman. I know Griffith, in his biography, studied the ways of his father, who was a Southern captain in the Civil War. I also know one thing that's confusing about a movie about the Civil War after the Civil War happened is that it was before most of us were born that Birth of a Nation came out. It's 1915, which isn't the year of the real Civil War, so don't panic. They're not filming it as it goes and finding out what's going to happen that way, like they did with World War II and all the movie cameras that were given to the Army, and that's what they do now, is they find out what's going on with the camera, and they're surprised as the rest of us. That's why we don't watch real war footage, because it's traumatic. The things that hurt another human being are ethically traumatic. We remember that as something that could be painful to us if it is so painful to someone else. And so we really don't want to drag in the whole, well, that's why we're violent towards other races and everything, because we don't really know that question. Why we would assume violence or slave ship over a culture that we're not familiar with or not sure if it's even worth talking about, and suddenly we've paid all this money for the slavery to exist. Like, that's one thing that gets me about the South, and one thing that they'll never admit is that they spent tons and tons of money on the slave trade. I mean, the ships at the beginning of Abraham Lincoln and all the things that they've been talking about in the slave trade at the very beginning of Birth of a Nation, and all the slave trade that it's worth, is millions of dollars have gone into it. Now we want our slaves to work our fields because that's what we paid for when we established or embellished her upon having slaves as being something we've invested in. That we've invested in slavery so much that it almost has an importance other than just being a race importance. And so we've got to look at the other angles. Also, one thing that's interesting about the censorship code of the early era, the production code, was that white slavery was mentioned as one of the terms that you can't use, or like you can't use white slavery in your movie. Like, I'm not sure what they call those scenes in Cleopatra where she's kind of dangled out in front of a courtesan of men. But I guess white slavery is female prostitution, and we don't like that word, and we're not going to use it here. And we heard many, many people get in trouble with the fact that there are some words that can't be used. And I, of all people, have to confess there are words that can't be used. I used a ton of words that can't be used myself, and I thought, well, if anybody would have heard that, I'd be in trouble. But it's not the words you can't use, because then you know that it's illegal, and it's illegal to use a can't word, because, you know, if you say it, in class, or you say it to an authority figure or something, then you could really get into a lot of punishment for the words you cannot say. But I find it interesting that we find that since this is out of date, it's actually in a movie we can now play, which is interesting because it doesn't have the same political progression of, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't have the publicity anymore of being like a real passionate statement on what it means to be a U.S. American born of the Civil War that took both sides of the nation, the North and the South, fighting it out and then coming together, I guess so, to form what we have now as America, that would go on and bring us to here now. And now we look at these both like a relic. The war as like a lost time in space that we didn't have cameras for, so what do we really know about it? Because don't we have to have like anthropological technology that we do now to know the now history of then? But I actually find that I can actually use the outdated to my advantage and say, well, that means that it's not, the publicity isn't as propagandistic. And if it still is, if it still rises as a currency in the midst of our times, for me to teach a class on D.W.Griffith and for there suddenly to be an out mode of like Lords of the Grand Dragon stand up and start getting more popular, that's not because of this or me. That's just what normally happens when the clan secretly gets together. And one thing that I got to state is they were around before this, but this movie makes it seem like this was the origin of them. But they had already dominated the South, for instance, before the North had the proclamation of abstaining. The proclamation that Lincoln made to free the slaves. It was the proclamation that he made, and there were already Klansmen set up in approach to not only the Old West, which were many cowboys were Klansmen, but also to the South, and where they could find ways of keeping things from falling into the savage, or the civilization versus savagery they call the Old West. And that's why it's always wild that the Native American is the savage one, because in all the Old West ones, they don't really have the vision quest factor of the peaceful Native American. They have the Native American at war. Now, one exception to that rule, that's always been an exception to that rule, is Last of the Mohicans, which is actually a silent film that's very like Griffith in the way that it's built, and it's built like a classical mode of silent film. And it's so fascinating to me that that's another reason this movie's kind of innocuous, is because now that it's a silent film, it doesn't carry with it the same publicity and the same public outcry as another film could in its publicity and its propaganda. It does very little to propaganda by not being caught up by today's standards, which we can all thank the censor board for still censoring this film 15 years after it came out and was not allowed to make a sound version, almost as much as we're saying, wow, Thomas Edison still really got one on Griffith on that one. He didn't let him go all the way, but Griffith pretty much went all the way. That he stopped at the struggle was because his budget from Birth of a Nation finally caught up to him 15 years earlier. I mean, if you look at The Sorrows of Satan combined with Avenging Conscience, like I said, they're similar movies. They're like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and Faust. But both of them trade up moments of being both, and they both were decisively close together in how a horror film is told. Like even Hitchcock with The Lodger is told that way. Hitchcock, being a big Birth of a Nation fan, said it's all there, isn't it? It's just a little violent, though. And as far as the Directors Guild came to exist and Hollywood came to exist, and at the time everyone was a Griffith pundit, and it was like this silent film era of gold when United Artists came out from Griffith, Fairbanks, Pickford, and Chaplin. It just seemed like the great stars of cinema history were now before our very eyes. And that's why it's so wild that it's an anticlimax for Griffith after he disappears from sound film. which is so chew you up and spit you out style of anyone else to go, because now that there's new technology that he can't manhandle because he's too buckshot into owing everything back from the silent era where everything was just so big and huge, and now we have to scale back to these like city walls that hold us all in. Well, that's not totally the story we're telling, because this is Griffith class, and we need to know that, yeah, like what developed from his stylistic language in Birth of a Nation, and then on to Intolerance. And Intolerance a lot harder to figure out because it's so modernist in the way that it chip-chops between 4 different tales of like important history, where Intolerance or like some kind of slavery was inhaled that went bad and caused a revolution and made everyone get killed, and Babylon fell, and the revolution in France failed again, all seen in Orphans of the Storm again. You know, the Jesus thing, whatever that was, it was just to give us hope that there was someone out there watching us. Although I really think that Griffith was kind of saying, no, with the Jesus thing, that no one's out there watching us. These are just the way movies like to be told. I'm telling you this movie the way it likes to be told. Like my friend Cecil B. DeMille would tell a movie like it needs to be told. Like that, the Jesus story is so much indifferent to any religious text in film because it is a storyline to make money. My theory is that the Bible itself probably changed after the movie versions came out to reflect more of what's in the movie versions, because the Bible's an ever-changing book. Like, they're always making differences on it. You can't memorize any of it because it slides around and sticks to other statements when you change its context. It's a very sticky book, but I look in the same anticlimactic way of the Bible being dated. Now we know women really aren't the evils of the earth like the Bible so loudly would tell us. And now we know that African Americans are not the evils of the earth, though the Birth of a Nation would so demise us to at least admit that they're subordinate when they're not slaves. And that's the problem I'm having with this Griffith racism. Is it that they're all subordinate blackface dudes, and because they're slaves, they have to be subordinate. And he's saying he's not reflecting them in any horrible way, but like, if someone's subordinate to you based on their race, that can be racism. I mean, it could also be like something that you've gone through, some image that you've had of a racist kind. It doesn't have to be like direct, like I'm running a Mandingo cult here or whatever. Like, you don't have to go that far, but I'm just saying that like in the Birth of a Nation, you could tell the blacks were subordinate to the whites. Even in that shot at the end that we're not sure if all black people go to heaven, all white people go to heaven, all black people go to hell. I'm not really sure what that message is, but I counted it in the book that it was like a religious Freemasonic iconography, that it wasn't really of the blacks dying in hell, because there were some blacks in heaven, and it wasn't really a picture perfect made of heaven and hell. It was the aftermath of the Civil War metaphoricalized into like these bodies laying everywhere that are just a stream to be lost in purgatory, basically, while the Northerner and Southerner, Lillian Gish and the Cameron boy, get together and stare off into the sea and erase all their memories of what just happened in the movie and in life, and whether there was a civil war. I know there was. It was a horrible thing. You can find out more from Time magazine. Not just from reading the Richard Schickel on Griffith, which is important, the most important for this class of books to be read, and I have it sitting over there, my beautiful book of Richard Schickel. And he was a Time magazine writer, and he wrote the story of Griffith. And I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for that book, because when I saw that book, I realized there was so much more to the story than just the story we told today. And the story we told today is only to tell you that the setting up of language of film had been all but done by Griffith, that had been partaken on as a mission by Porter to seal every problem with the editing problems. To seal every one of them with a way to seal an edit is to not notice the edits there in the classical era. If you do a jump cut, everybody sees that the edit's there, but you can do those smoothly nowadays and almost breed over this neoclassical rule that you didn't even see any of the edits because they're rapid fire, or they're taking in just impressions of the scene and impressions of the face. And, you know, these impressionistic ones can yearn right into the expressionist big, long takes of a guy walking down an alley and you can't see him in his own shadow. I mean, that's tableau. That's Cabinet Dr. Caligari tableau. He's walking in the shadow, but you can't see him walking, but you know he is because he gets out of the shadow. And when he gets out of the shadow, you put it together in your mind that he was walking through the shadow that you could not see him in because it was so pitch black. And that's why the frame looked like it was solidly still, even though behind the shadow, Dr. Caligari, the somnambulist, is coming down the shadow. And we already see that with the ever-facing expressionistic film and impressionistic film that we have an offshoot of the D.W.Griffith or classical method. And that it's the classical method makes perfect sense, and it kind of shows why Buster Keaton used to train in a general that was from the Southern Army, and there's just more melodrama to the side that may not win. Like, I don't think back then they thought the South won, but they definitely thought it ended in kind of such chaos that, like, even the Klan had to pick up the pace and fix things up for the South. Whether or not that's true, we've never gotten to in history books. I've looked that up, and I've seen some represent the Klan as, like, these kind of heroic Boy Scout types that are going to go on a mission and save bad things from happening to good people, right? And then I've heard others that'll just, like, they'll drop you just because you're not a white race or you're a race is not preferred to them. And I don't really know much about racial hatred groups, but that to say Birth of a Nation was caused by a hatred group is not exactly a well put thing, because Griffith was more confused about what the role of everybody in the film was, and it's to our effect that he was confused about the role of the Klan coming in the South and, like, shaping things up, because who would have expected such a Southern organization that had rid them of violence that had come about from the chaos of the slaves being let go, which most of the slaves that were let go or freed were taken to the North because they were put out of arrangement to become slaves again. That's how all the money went away. That's why the South lost. That's not in any movie. That's how the South lost. They lost their slave trade. Their slave trade cost them a lot of money to put up. Now they lost all their money. The slaves are no longer slaves. The war goes on. There's no real peace about it. You know, one thing that's an oddity of the Civil War is that the North and the South admired each other. Like, you can even see this kind of capitalizing over in Gone with the Wind, how the North and the South would cooperate if it just weren't for the, you know, the proclamation. And there are all these things throughout this film, these notions that things could have got right and things could have gone right at a few of the turns. But a few of the turns took their turn for the worse. The next thing you know, we're in the middle of a war that's drenching everybody. But what I really want to point out is that the way the scenes are assembled, and that I've looked at them at a shot by shot, they're not so much just hierarchical, which we'll find out they are, but they're also pointing at the way a story needs be told if in the cinema rank of an American film, because now we've got, what is it? An American masterpiece. We had Avenging Conscience already as a full film, but not a lot of people saw it. I mean, they knew it was a full-length film, Avenging Conscience, by Griffith. Judith of Bethulia almost is too, you know. And then the Avenging Conscience really comes on the screen with that devil riding a bike, or riding like the skeleton's dinosaur thing, and then there's all these scary stories, and then it goes to that Faust idea. And that kind of stuffy Faust idea that he's been in his closet all day long and needs to get out and become like the Prince of Arabia or something is all going on within the Faust story. What he needs is more experiences. What he needs is more women, some music, some flying on a magic carpet, whatever, just something to change his scenario. And we see this Faust imagery in Fritz Lang's Destiny, which was an expressionistic film, German expressionistic. And we see it in The Thief of Baghdad with Byrwell Walsh. And we talked about The Thief of Baghdad and how in that we have silent era star Douglas Fairbanks doing all his own professional stunts. And I think that's one of the reasons Buster Keaton got away with doing all of his stunts and Harold Lloyd, is because they saw that Douglas Fairbanks did these really hardcore stunts that he had to be 100% approved to be able to do. Now, stunt work is like that. You have to be 100% sure you're going to make it and be okay and sign a paper that says I'll make it and be okay 100%, or I lose money. And if I have to pay for my funeral, then that's going to be a lot of money to buy out the movie with. Basically, you have to know, like, you have to know as things get set one after the other that one's going to follow another. And if you happen to know you can survive a stunt, then empirically you can promise them you'll survive the stunt. But you had to have tried the stunt before in almost most cases of that, or at least an equivalent of what it would be like in that stunt. But that means that I'm out of a job, because somebody's going to be the stunt teacher when it comes time to grading next semester's papers, and we'll be all into Tarantino in it. Without a stuntman in here, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through that as magically as we have been with the great Griffith. And one thing I failed to do in this class was really get off the notion of Birth of a Nation of being his crux point. And really, I made a point early on that, like, well, wouldn't it be weird if all your movies were good and only the bad one? Everybody's only talking about the bad one, but all the rest of your movies are good, all 120 of them? Because Griffith, he'll get into making short films, and we've seen, like, Corner and Wheat, Musketeers of Pig Alley, and Enoch Arden. We've seen these biograph shorts that Griffith really put a lot of time, money, care, distance into. And then he's finally keeping up with the Italian film with Avenging Conscience. He doesn't really know Avenging Conscience is to be his debut feature, that Judith of Bethulia was that, but not long enough to be Avenging Conscience, which is an hour and a half. And Sorrows of Satan does a lot to play upon the Avenging Conscience, only in ways that it gets you more dragged into the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. The Faustian images that are all there of this guy, like, somehow embettering himself by trading his soul to have, like, wine, women, and song, just like in Arabian Nights. And so you get Faust and Arabian Nights. There's a comparison that could really be good for the final. Like, how do you see the elements of Fritz Lang's Destiny telling a Faust story and an Arabian Nights story as though they're parallel? I mean, think of that. So that's the bonus question for the final. If you answer that question, you don't have to take the rest of the final. And you don't have to watch necessarily the last lecture or the last class, which I'm sure is just going to be fun, silly. Let's wear all of our Klansmen's hat to school. No, we don't want to do that, because then they might think we're not making fun of them. Because, like, really, I always wondered, with the Coneheads, if they were making fun of the Klan, or if they just were Klan in their outer space suits, or I don't know. But one thing that's weird about this movie, Birth of a Nation, is it's kind of like trying to side with the Birth of the Klan. I mean, I know there's Birth of a Race elements in it, where he was going to break off and make an African-American film with it, in all these different, but it also dead ends in all these different directions, and all we have left is the Klan roaring through, just like was the original plan of the movie. So it all came full circle. And in the movie, they're saying that during the Civil War, the Klan is being invented, or right after the Civil War, they were invented just to stop the chaos that was in the South from all the blacks being let go, and not an ability to work because slavery was against the law, and most of the blacks had fled, and the ones that hadn't fled were ready for a fight. Well, that fight came to them in terms of the Ku Klux Klan, whether they existed before the Civil War, which I'm pretty sure they did, having known that the Freemasons and the Illuminati have been around for thousands of years. Before Christ were the Illuminati, and we had them with, going back to King Arthur, especially with the Knights Templar and all those deadly things associated with stealing paintings and showing them around the world. And, Now it's like Griffith's giving us the grand tour, and Intolerance, he's showing us the grand tour of the fall of civilization based on the harping up of intolerance. But that's only what I wanted to partly talk about, because if you look at this film, as it goes on, like even in the beginning when it shows this Virginia plantation and the people sitting there and the Stonemans and the Camerons all getting in different parts of the shot, and like there's brothers that are friends that end up fighting and kill each other later in the movie, but they're all playing around. This is like the plantation at the beginning after the slavery stuff's all scathed. And then you go to this beginning, and then there's this cat and this dog that are set on each other, and they're kind of fighting. And he's like, no, we'll separate the cats and the dogs. And he's saying that, right, as like some metaphor for blacks and whites. And I'm not really saying that the film has a ton of subliminal messages like that. But the ones it has are really necessary to look at, because if he's saying that he's going to break up the fight between the cats and the dogs by being a northerner, does that mean he's going to separate the blacks from the whites so they can't get at each other anymore? I mean, this is a bold metaphor. You know, it's like cats and dogs, well, they always fight. They're opposites, you know. It's like, really, these looks at how we're looking at people are not only outdated, but also psychologically at question in terms of being outdated, because if you believed half the things that we see in the films of this era, we're not exactly doing the ideological brain crunch to catch things up where there are now times. The only silent film I can really think of right now, well, besides the silent film by none other than Mel Brooks, who did a pretty good parody of the silent films and is actually kind of enjoyable and watchable and not really too advantageous of the vaudeville style of it all. But that silent film that came out, The Artist, we've talked about that too, and really, those haven't, although they've moved in, they're movers and shakers, the one for me that really sent it home in terms of silent films and how to tell a story visually and how to really bring home a story that you're trying to tell with the visual angles and the visual style, would be like Robert Redford's movie where he's on that boat. Oh, what is it called? It's a good movie. It's, well, he's on this boat and all is lost is what it's called. He's on this boat and it starts to break and leak on his last day there and smash and sink for no reason under the water, and he has to get out of his boat and get out of there before the whole place self-destructs and goes under. He's got to get above the boat. When all is lost, he's got to get up. He lives. Ambiguously, we hear his voice at the beginning and into the movie, so he must have lived because he added on to what he said at the beginning. But it could be that he got out, was okay, like the movie suggested, but he still lost his boat. He still lost everything on it. And it still wasn't cool that it was an accident and a storm and things that just hit him at once. But one thing that's cool about that film is it's like Castaway. There ain't a bit of dialogue for like in a couple of hours of that. I mean, like All Is Lost is like 2 hours of no dialogue. He doesn't even talk to himself. Like when I'm alone, I'm like teaching Masterclass to myself, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is this how much longer it has to go on? This is great. I love teaching this class. You know, it's like, I have to talk, but if I just sat here for an hour, I'd have to have like a boat falling behind me and crushing behind me and collapsing to not talk long enough for it to be an All Is Loster. And All Is Loster is one of those ones I call a silent film with a push, because they usually have the little bit of sound in it, the tag where he's like reading the poem of All Is Lost, and then at the end, he quotes it again, but he adds to it, so you know that he's okay, sort of, you can. I think he was, but that you forgot to listen for any dialogue. That whole movie is now intrinsically sending you straight back to that movie to notice whether or not there's any talking in it. This is kind of a self-expressive, self-reflexive way to make a movie like a silent film. Even though there are sound effects of just about everything that's going wrong. Like if the clock falls, boosh, it's a sound effect. If a sink crashes, it's a sound effect, you know. So it's not like a pure sound film. It's almost where you get those Chaplin hybrids where he's got sound effects like in modern times, but in every other respect, it's a silent film, even with a recorded music piece by Chaplin, who also did the music for City of Lights, and he did music for his movies too. A very rare combination of things that he did. He acted, directed, wrote. Chaplin did. He acted, directed, wrote, like the Gold Rush. Acted, directed, and wrote. But for some of it, he also, for the remake that he did of the sound film, he did the score and some of the speaking for the Gold Rush re-release for the sound film, that they were able to get that. And strangely enough, the film has preserved over, even in its silent film original form, to our culture today as something we look at, not outdated, to say this is what it's like being poor, but still having a sense of humor. He's poor, he's klutzy, he's an ex-alcoholic, he's thrown out on the streets. Now here he is in the Alaskan mountains being chased by a bear, and he doesn't know he's about to fall off the side of a mountain. And I mean, we're taking it as hilarious. Every clumsy move. That's one thing I like about vaudeville. It's okay. It's like every clumsy move is a joke. I know we all don't believe in Scatterfreud, like that whole thing about Schadenfreude, about how like if you see something bad happen to someone, you laugh. But the slapstick era of vaudeville was just about taking busters, like Buster Keaton got his name, Buster, because he took a buster. He fell on his face. Like you look at Chris Farley of today's cinema, or like, you know, the modern era cinema, and where he'd just fall over on a table and the table would smash and he'd fall over and we'd all jump cheering out of our seats and like, we want to see more of that. That was the slapstick beyond slapstick. I mean, he'll take a bong rip, fall over on a table and smash it, you know? That's the kind of college we're sending our kids to, bro. And this is the kind of college we've got to have, is the communicatory one, because I've been spending a lot of time just raving about certain Griffith techniques and showing you how he did the shot reverse shot, but he did it in an objective, subjective kind of way. Like in True Heart Susie, when you see Lillian Gish, she's still the objective. The subjective is the man who sees her. We see the films we see, especially in the silent era, through a man's eyes. You know, I can think of Pandora's Box as being through a woman's eyes, or Diary of a Lost Girl by G.W. Pabst, and those movies have a certain ability to do that, but usually all movies from the silent era are looking from a man's point of view, or a neutral point of view, and the neutral point of view wins out in Gone with the Wind, because in Birth of a Nation, there's a lot of cross people seeing things, and then you see it closer. And they're so meticulous. Like a guy can see the flag coming out and being shoved in his cannon meter. Right then, he sees him coming, and then right then there's an edit of the guy shoving it in there. And so it's so properly placed and so down to the right tape marker to where you got to land, and everything's got to land directly there. And I mean, when Griffith directs, he makes every piece move the direction he needs it to move. The person, the thing, the place, where we're at. And why does he repeat certain places in Birth of a Nation? Why do we always get the southern house getting taken over in Birth of a Nation, and why is it different in each time? And that's because the war's going on, and they wanted to show what it was like before the war, when they were just saying, well, this slavery thing's going to lead to something bad. And then next thing you know, it's their own personal house that's being invaded all the way up to the end by the Northerners to destroy their house. And that kind of goes into Gone with the Wind and how they're fighting in these Victorian houses that are buildings. And Griffith's version of Victorian house isn't as good as, like, say, one of those Jane Austen Age of Innocence, like Victorian setups we see in movies today. But it's a total preamble to that, because it's like saying, well, we're doing the restoration, and we're going to show how expensive and posh and we can live at in America, just because we're the aristocracy and we're about to win back the slaves, that the only thing that was making the South even close to an aristocracy, which is why you got to pay attention to a lot of this, because you're like, well, I didn't know that Griffith really came out of the classical mindset just because he was from theater and he was correcting all the things that Porter couldn't correct in his movie. He said he got him corrected by intolerance, probably closer to Birth of a Nation. He got all of his shots and all of his ideas and all the ways to suture, tutor cinema together to teach you while it's not looking like it's passing by. His persistence of vision is his editing style of one, more, many more, much more, one. You know, you can do those kind of patterns of what you see in an establishing shot, then a mid shot on the frame, then a mid shot on the bust of the person talking, then a close up to their hand of what they're reading, or their eyes looking off in the distance, match to their eyes looking off, and it's a wild frontier of a plateau. But you've seen how we've just put 6 shots together that don't look like they've been put together. They look like they were already shots that were there when we got to the movie, but at some point somebody put them there at some time. Isn't that a fascinating thought about editing? So now we have DJ Spooky coming along with like one of these wheel-looking things. Like we've got the LaRue here. It's like one of these wheel-looking things, and it's like they've got this whole idea that like over and under and around the characters and scheming in Birth of a Nation was actually the government lagging hard on trying to get their Klansman operations off the ground anyway, and we're using Griffith's film to do that. But he didn't seem to mind because he thought anybody that buys a ticket at this point is going to get me out of debt, is what he was thinking. The controversy at first he was okay with, because then he was like, now everybody wants to see the movie all over the nation and all over the world. And to be honest, a lot of the viewers that saw it all over the world didn't understand it. I mean, it wasn't really until Intolerance came out in America that the worldwide had a real favor of what they liked about American films. And it was really Intolerance that showed the rest of the world that American films could be made perfectly. And it wasn't just Russia, it was other countries like Germany and France. Especially France fell in love with Intolerance because of the way it told different stories back and forth in different diegeses of the narrative, but brought them all together into one grand narrative about intolerance. And then we have modernism. But we don't exactly have it at the same time, because now we've got a branch of modernism that's been going through the silent era quite a while, besides Birth of a Nation, which is like classical hierarchy, which is like shot reverse shot, which is like 180-degree rule, where everything stays on one side of the line. If you're shooting across the line, you have to establish it by going on the line, like the Stagecoach, where he's riding one way, and then you establish him on the line, and then he's riding. You think he's going the same way because you've established that he can go in any direction if you shot him coming at you on the line. And that's how we're going to describe the 180 line for now. And the 180 line was delusionally used as the 180 line in Iron Horse anyway, and we've got Iron Horse up in here. And I was just thinking of silent films in the silent era, and it has to be a shame for us to fall in the silent era because there's a whole set of different theory on like why visuals are the way they are. We are still dealing with melodrama here, and melodrama and war and catastrophe and things going wrong, and things going wrong can go really well with a war film as well as a melodrama film. A turn to the worst in a melodrama. And Griffith played out the characteristics of his genres, especially the melodrama, which was his recognizable genre. But that's a genre common among the silent film era, done in ways that are romantic, singularly male, singularly female melodrama. He did a lot of female melodramas, Way Down East being one of them. And a lot of that movie's from her eyes suddenly. But we're uncomfortable with anything from her eyes, so we're executors of getting rid of that information or whatever. Like, not look when she looks and feel uncomfortable at what she sees. And she sees these foreboding men that are making walls around her, you know. It's this whole idea we can barricade in the innocent. And then keep the innocent barricaded in, and then make them our slave, and then make the innocent lost, and then punish them even more. And then, if they're rescued, they'll really, really appreciate the rescue. And the appreciating of the rescue of any director other than Griffith. And Griffith rescued cinema from Thomas Edison. He rescued the man who was going to die in intolerance. We think he's a good guy. He didn't kill his lead actor. What a great guy. And that goes into the whole ethics of films. Does your lead actor die in one film and come back in another? Because, like, that's metaphysics almost. That he didn't really die in the film is good, because then we can't pass on the hurt clause that no one gets hurt really making a movie. And that's where you get the stunt double. Having a guarantee he can do the stunt, because no one gets hurt on a movie or even part of a movie or anything. Although I did see a Jackie Chan making of where he broke his leg in Rumble at the Bronx. And normally you're not supposed to see anyone get hurt, but that looked like it freaking hurt, dude. And that's why they normally don't have that on funniest home videos of samurais falling to the ground or ninjas taking a ripper across a building. But if you think about it, even in those cases where there's Asian or there's other foreigners in the film, there's other foreign races, movies that are made in other countries, like a movie that's made in China, Hong Kong, like Fallen Angels. And I'm willing to bet that the amazing things that came syntactically, verbally, and metaphorically, and the way to frame the shot, a lot of times comes from Birth of a Nation, or Intolerance. This one is more of the Mulholland Drive. We're going to try a new postmodern style of no one is in the lead, but that it's a Broken Blossoms piece because of its Romeo and Juliet narrativization of the lover being so in love that it's a deadly lover or a femme fatale, and we have all this German expressionism in it because of that. But what is the Griffith about this is that you take these perfect people and perfect looking people that are stars, and you take these perfect settings that are like gangster, and it's like Musketeers of Pig Alley. You set it up so that the shot, that style of the shot is what we're watching now, and to watch the style of the shot is to move forward the action, because the action only moves forward as it gives you a total history of the style of the shot in Fallen Angels. And every scene is a different way to shoot a scene in this, lends credence to its film language. It's every bit as important as Birth of a Nation to watch Fallen Angels, because of Fallen Angels making a new way to do each scene and never a copied scene. It's jump cuts, it's followaways, it's cuts to match on disjunction, match on no action, eyeline match thrown out, Hiroshima Monomore type black sets where you just get like the, you know, the building, the establishing shot, and don't really get into it yet. Fallen Angels is an interesting movie because it takes, like Intolerance, to 2 to 3 to maybe even 4 different stories and flights around in them, and some of them overlap. Notice there was no overlapping in the Griffith film, unfortunately, but there was overlap. And the Lily and Gish Rocking the Baby is a little bit of overlap, but it's not the same. That's how you change films. In this one, it's racing through the movie, finding all the pieces of the film and putting them all back in as you're watching. It's like, oh, this went here, good, show them. Oh, this went here, good, show them. It's like they're racing you to the end to show you what they had to show you about the making of the film coming true on screen, because of them showing you how they made the film by the interpretation of each shot. And here we have Asians that aren't being looked down upon, and that's a step forward from the Griffith kind of main of like, now there's a foreigner in the film, I guess we've got to step and look at them from either a higher distance or from a pitiable cause, or that something has just gone wrong in general. And in this, the whole motion, the whole action is Romeo and Juliet. Here's where we get a Broken Blossoms. And then I go back to that thing about how we're only comparing it now to Birth of a Nation, and now we're not. is that, why in the first place in contextual studies did everyone that was doing Griffith studies get so hung up on Birth of a Nation if in many documents it says to just pass over it, disavow it. It says in one of my books, if you're African American, disavow it. Like just move on from the Klan scenes and go on to something else. And I've only seen like makeshift B films that even had the Klan in a specifically heroic order after that. And I'm not so sure that they weren't anti-Klan in disguise like those Reefer Madness type things. But this isn't in Birth of a Nation. He's thinking wide and clear that the Klansmen are the objective, that he wants to clean up the South. That being such an intriguing message, done in an outdated, mundane kind of force, has come to terms with why we study the cinema in general and how to tell a story. So he tells that story of the Civil War. It's completely classic. But then we look at other things that were happening around the time of D.W.Griffith, and one of them I've already brought up, and that is when the French masterpiece 5-hour-long LaRue was released by Abel Gance in 1923. In the silent era, a lot of things had been chapterized, indexed, and been done in the history of film for France to reach such a big masterpiece crew on this and masterpiece picture. There's other ones I'm forgetting, like Raymond Binard in the sound era with Les Miserables, etc. The 5-hour. Children of Paradise, the 5-hour. It's always the French that are introducing the style of the cinema. In Children of Paradise, it's poetic realism. LaRue begins poetic realism. That's why they say in France that there's only cinema after LaRue and before LaRue, because it sets up a whole design as to how to make an epic film, but also do it in a poetic realist kind of way. The LaRue film without sound does seem to make a lot of sound with the railroad station, but you can't really tell that. But LaRue is 1923, and Griffith's main heyday comes off after it really starts to have a denouement right as soon as what? Orphans of the Storm is over in 1922. I mean, he has a couple of good ones. Sorrows of Satan coming up. He has Lady of the Pavements, which is a ways off. He's got America, which is controversial. He's got some good films solid coming out. Battle of the Sexes, the remake. It kind of looks like a TV show. Something you'd see raising your TV. And so where does that get us from having Musketeers of Pigalle, Flying Here to Fallen Angels, Finding Broken Blossoms messages? Not much for the jump cut in Griffith. They were trying to fix things like that from happening before they went back to the mistake they wanted. That wasn't a mistake because they did it on purpose accidentally. The jump cut. They're like, we're accidentally breaking up the film in a way that's not a legal cut. Editing move, it's a jump cut. There's even a magazine called Jump Cut. Maybe we'll write for it for someday, and we'll say, you know what makes it a jump cut? Just taking it off the same time it was on and leaving it on the same space, or taking it off the same space and leaving it on the same time, preferably progressively forward in all cases. And boom, you got a jump cut. And then if you really want like a edit-to-edit, like propaganda film, you could put a picture of me standing there waving Birth of a Nation around and then cut to a picture of my pizza box being empty. And this is because I study silent films, and silent films are only so lucrative as they are rare. Really, the rare lucrativeness of this movie being rare, it's so rare that it could pay off this whole class for Harvard, USC, and Calarts to even be a class. Just one film, I could turn it in and be like, well, this is such a rare film. This En Chien Andalou copy, for instance, is so rare that if I just turned it in, well, I'd be a lot better off of paying off all the rights and royalties and whatever else we use as filmmakers in our careers of being critics and whatever else. But then, there are other movies that are out in the silent era that are really going for stylistics too, and kind of basically banking on what stylistics need to be. And that one director that always gets underlooked and underpromoted is Carl Dreyer, and I think Carl Dreyer has a lot of hits from The President on to Days of Wrath, and on to Ordette, and that he finished with Gertrude, and the Carl Theodor Dreyer's the master of cinema, that he does beautiful things with images, but not just in sound films, but in silent films. He's on a roll in his silent films, and he's been on an art film roll that's been keeping him going, that leads up to Vampire right after Master of the House. Master of the House has kind of these quadrants in the cover, and what that is a full shot of the film, being that the full shot of the film is a square bracket, and he works within framing the square bracket, like he's building within the squares of the bracket to get the show, which is almost like those Lottie Reiniger punch-out tickets on the cover, but really it's people in the shadows of the shot of the square. And so you see the square, then you cut to another square. It's almost like an Ozu shot, where everything is right in the middle and facing forward and facing the camera in an Ozu. And then in Master of the House, they're kind of placed to the side with the proscenium still down, but they're hunching out these squares. And why I'm bringing up Master of the House and Carl Dreyer is because then you see that Ingvar Kalm and all those other movies by Victor Seastrom were really a Scandinavian influence on cinema as a whole, more so than like the classical style has been able to grab onto, and that the classical style is in fact a forward motion, first act, second act, third act, linearity, beginning, middle, and end. Classical is also not allowing us to see the way it makes itself. That's a modern characteristic of it. It also shows that you can believe almost anything if it's put to you beautifully, aesthetically, and that if a beautifully and aesthetically picture is put there, we'll believe that it's that picture doing that. Whether or not we believe that's history is pretty racked up, because really, I mean, no one can really say that since they weren't filming the actual Civil War, even if it had been reenacted up to that point, somehow in a conspiracy theory. But if it had been racked up to that point in a conspiracy theory, it still would have been like the telephone gang. It still would have changed. And there's no way we can record exact history except for have all things recording at all times. And this is only going to be a recording for an hour, and I'm sitting here going, I'm still trying to explain that there are languages of films in other mediums that didn't just come from Griffith. Or the standard is why argue only that Griffith's film Birth had the language come from it? Why didn't Intolerance, which was the one the Russians are editing and editing and editing over and over and over, trying to find the 1,001 ways to edit Intolerance? And that's not what we're calling modern and subjective and like overruled of metaphors, you know, like subjective metaphors, expressive metaphors of the director seen through Griffith. His ability to lean back and say, oh, I love humanity so much, but I'm so glad that guy got saved before he was hung. It would have been so awful if he was hung at the end of that movie, you know, but he's not. So it's a happy ending. So we all got to go out going, whoosh. And that's Griffith's thing, man. That puts it right there on the Redneck channel. If we walk out of his movie going, whoosh, you know, way down east, whoosh, Broken Blossoms, whoosh, then we're pretty much in the throes of what he used for his style to get us to watch the film, the same style that's making us laugh at Birth of a Nation and say, that's not what would have happened. That guy would have busted some chops. You know, you can be watching it from different angles and you're not so sure that any of it is really relevant now that it's silent film, now that it's got blackface, now that it's not what the Civil War was, except for up to that time and date, which was dated because women hadn't gotten the vote yet, etc. Or we take it for what it was and how Griffith had lynched it over to the government, back to Edison, and it was a bad mistake because they could have Grand Dragoned it even more. Now, the point of all that is how the items of the scenes were stickier and more conscientious in The Avenging Conscience. You can see how the scenes are way more smoothly put together, although there are other universe that is in those films, even Stars of Satan, these films have a expressionistic use of shadow and light. With the one shadow, they're really representative of what film noir is to be someday, the one light shooting, you know. And the chiaroscuro was a Griffith idea, you know, that they would use in 1919's Caligari. The chiaroscuro lightings in Broken Blossoms, when he's like partially lit and you can only see part of him, and then he's not lit, then he's partially lit. The one light source is the chiaroscuro, because half of it's shadow and half of it's available. And then in those tableaus where it's shadows that appeared and reappeared, that chiaroscuro lighting. I mean, chiaroscuro lighting typically means one light to use for natural light. And I think these things, well, they are important director tools and techniques to learn, even coming up to the ranks of the beginning of all film directing. And directing didn't really mean that you were in charge of the film until Edwin S. Porter got a hold of it. Because, like, Edison didn't direct many of those films that he was releasing that were offending everybody. And Griffith was trying to become a director for Edison, and Edison said that they're not going to use directors anymore in cinema. And then Griffith started Hollywood to change that. So he did. So he's good. But now we read a little bit forward, and now he's made a racist movie and all his money's gone. We don't like him anymore. And the battle to really still like him, but to like come confused out of his eccentric, you know, movies, as an eccentric person has made these real controversial movies. But if you look at the Hollywood classical cinema that comes from the Griffith films, from Avenging Conscience and the Battle of the Sexes and the more easy setups like you did like that, you're already seeing that that's a kind of force of desire of the American film, like to have a classical setup. Whereas here, Un Chien Andalou, by the time you're at the end of the silent era, early sound era, doing sound effect tracks for an avant-garde picture, and this is how many minutes long? 17 minutes, this is. And we'd watch it for the rest of the class, but we only have 3 minutes left. But Un Chien Andalou is everything that didn't, it's like that Mulholland Drive factor. It's the art film, it's the avant-garde. It's everything that didn't come out of Birth of a Nation, came out of here in a totally random, different way. That the theme of slavery may be told here, but it's only told by ants crawling out of a guy's hand because he's got a hole in his hand all of a sudden, and they're seeing hallucinations in the film that we're seeing represented by imagery, that the representative imagery of the hallucinations in the film creates the dreamlike film that it is. It's Salvador Dali meets Louise Buñuel. It's a great film. At the beginning, they film an eye getting sliced in half. It's actually a cow's eye, but they make it look like a human eye. And this is one of those things where it's like, wow, I'm glad nobody got hurt. Like, it probably hurt the cow if it was still alive when they got the eye from it, but usually the cow would be dead before you get an eye from it, right? I don't know. But there's a small wind of cloud that travels right in front of the moon. And then in the very next shot, they sliced that eye in half. And I thought, well, that was pretty much the jump cut that nobody expected, but we all saw coming, because we all knew that these avant-garde makers had gotten together, and however they've screened these films to us, have just awoken us, shocked us, dragged us out of our smallness. Because when we're in Griffith mode, we can really get lackadaisical and forget where codes go and why codes were built, and why codes for like putting someone here and putting someone there is important, especially even more so in intolerance, like why showing the whole picture and then blowing it all up is a certain style of Griffith, that all the pictures there in The Birth of a Nation, all the South is there, and then it's blown up into pieces, is one of his disaster film traits that he likes to do in disaster films. And LaRue has these kind of consequentially huge sets that are making big, vast claims, and they're coming from the Griffith range and style. And then I had Grand Hotel. I want to talk about Grand Hotel and rules of the game. And we're running out of time, so let's just say Grand Hotel, classical Hollywood cinema. I dare you to watch it. every scene seems suture tutored in. Taught how they did it, walked how they did it, can't tell that it's there. And everything is in musicality synced up to the image. Even the Blue Danube, when the whole hotel is exercising its objectivity as a taxonomical entrance and exit to the biggest hotel in the world that you'll ever see in finer stars in the world. And that's Garbo, John Barrymore, Joan Crawford, Wallace Beery, and Lionel Barrymore. And that's in the 30s. It's not a silent film. It's right after the era of silent film ended. It's 1933, 32, I want to say. Already this masterpiece of classical Hollywood cinema, you could say. And what's beautiful about Grand Hotel is it uses all the rules there are, including the musical syncopation. Puts together the visuals of a beautiful fluff piece that you're just like, I just want to stare at this and be entertained at this for hours. Winding up all your favorite actors like John Barrymore and Greta Garbo. And it works in such a space that you're seeing how classical is still big. Griffith has made these styles big, and now he's going with more of the battle of the sexes kind of thing. But really for Griffith, his romantic melodramas weren't always up to keep, because somebody'd be either too important, like in True Heart Susie, or somebody'd either be like too unimportant, like in True Heart Susie. And I'm sorry I'm seeing that in such a well-balanced melodrama of female melodrama by Griffith, but that we have to close for today. I'll remind you that rules of the game, and we may talk about Grand Hotel and rules of the game in a while as being like somewhat symbiotic, but also as complete opposites of each other. And the one thing about rules of the game is that it's taking the rules of D.W.Griffith and the other books of all filmmakers, the books of all filmmakers, because John Renoir is always talking about filmmakers. So the rules are the books of all filmmakers for the game. The books of all filmmakers for the game. And that's how the movie's played out. He takes a book of Griffith, he takes a book of Chaplin, he takes a book of himself, Renoir, he takes a book of the Grand Illusion, the people checking in, the music, the life, the lightness, the atmosphere. And we could just keep getting excited and keep getting excited, but I've actually run you over the curb for today. So there's 3 more classes, be it all of them. The last one, so there's actually 2.5, because the last one, we're coming up with a final, and it's going to be juicier than today's final. If you decide to take that one, you can, and I'm not going to reimburse you right now to say what it is, but you can do that as a final grade. Now, coming up on these last 3 classes, I just wanted you to know we'll be off a little bit before next semester starts, and I haven't chosen an on date for when we're starting next semester, but be aware, we are doing Auteur style again, only we're fast-forwarding to the postmodern and learning about Quentin Tarantino, and not totally without his permission either. So that should be cool, because it seems like no negative animosity has come out of any of this Auteur teaching, and that's great, because we handled a nervous center one with Griffith. It's like, you know, taking a bomb apart and before it blows, you know. But anyway, we thank you for coming today. We're going to have plenty more in those last 3 classes to decide and dictate about and see where we really place Griffith in the end of all this, and we'll have a final thought on that as well. So we'll see you for the remaining classes. Thank you. YouTube Masterclass.